Hello everyone and welcome to week 9 of Poll 101, American National Government. Now this is a big week because not only are we discussing campaigns and elections in American politics, but Election Day is this Tuesday, so make sure you find time to vote before Election Day. For this lecture, we're going to mostly focus on election rules and procedures in presidential elections because this class and this lecture coincides with the 2020 presidential election. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand the differences between the primary election and the general election, as well as the different types of primary elections, understand the role and function of the Electoral College, and we'll wrap up this lecture with my favorite area of study, campaign strategies. So let's get started. Now, every 2 years, voters head to the polls to select all 435 members of the House and 1/3 of all members of the Senate. Every 4th year, voters also indirectly select the president and vice president. This process is known as the general election, and by law, it is held in November of every even-numbered year. But before candidates for each of these offices can be elected, they must first be nominated. This process, known as the primary election, is governed by state laws, which means that there are variations throughout the 50 states in the ways that the candidates are nominated. So prior to the 1830s, party leaders, such as pre-existing members of Congress, were the ones who nominated candidates to the general election. So voters had absolutely no say in determining who should run for office. It's like asking people to vote on which football team is better. But you can only choose between the Jets or the Falcons. Both are awful, and so it's not really much of a choice at all. So instead of having party elites choose who we vote for in the general election, we, as the voters, choose among a variety of candidates in our respective party who we believe should advance to the general election. Again, this is called the primary election, an election conducted within a party to select its candidate for the general election. So a lot of people think that primaries have always been around, and that's how we've always conducted our elections. But that's just simply not true. And as we'll discuss in this lecture, voters have had to fight for more and more of a voice in how we elect politicians over time. In fact, in the early 1900s, coming off the heels of the progressive movement, Wisconsin became the very first state to implement a statewide primary electoral system that was not administered by party elites. But since the Constitution outlines that each state retains the power to regulate its own elections, that means that over time, each state has adopted its own unique rules and regulations for primary elections. So in this lecture, we'll talk about some of those key differences, such as the difference between a primary and a caucus, different state-level rules for who can vote in a primary or caucus, different rules for when each state conducts its primary election, and some of the more bizarre rules regarding each party's nominating convention. So just to recap, primary elections occur before the general election. Primary elections are conducted within a party where voters choose which candidate they want to represent their party. Then, in the general election, one candidate from each party will face off in the general election. So let's examine each party's 2020 presidential primary in more detail. At one point during the Democratic presidential primary in 2020, there were as many as 29 major candidates who had declared their candidacy. And major kudos to you if you can name more than half of the candidates in this photo. And the goal for each of these candidates is to win as many delegates as possible from each state. And we're going to talk more about what that means in a moment, but let's shift briefly to the Republican presidential primary. Even though Donald Trump is the incumbent Republican president, he still had to declare he was running for office and had to receive his party's support for the nomination, which he secured quite easily. In fact, it's actually pretty common that the party of an incumbent president will cancel some state primaries in efforts to save the party and the state money. And as you can imagine, this led to several of Trump's Republican challengers calling foul. And again, I think it's important to keep in mind that the primary electoral system as we know it today has really only been around for the last 50 years or so. So it's by no means a perfect electoral system, as we'll see in this lecture. Now consider the quote from Joe Walsh, who challenged President Trump in the 2020 primary. Quote, "Trump and his allies and the Republican National Committee are doing whatever they can do to eliminate primaries in certain states and make it very difficult for primary challengers to get on the ballot in a number of states." So ask yourselves, should primaries be canceled for incumbent presidents? Is the argument that it saves parties and state governments money and resources a valid argument? Is this a tradition worth preserving? Or does it not really matter, and we should just let the voters decide between the two candidates in the general election? And these are all important questions that you will face throughout your lives as politically engaged democratic citizens. So once candidates have declared they're running for office and get their name on the state primary ballots, they then have to adjust their campaigning in accordance with the type of primary that state holds. The majority of states use primary elections to nominate the candidates for each party, while about 10 states use caucuses and approximately 5 use a combination of both primaries and caucuses. The difference between the two are actually quite striking. Simply put, primaries are elections in which voters indicate their choice for a party's nominee by private ballot, while caucuses are meetings in which party members publicly determine their preferred nominee. Now, caucuses are really a prime example of direct democracy in action, in which everyone in the community gets together at the same exact time on the same exact day, and they cast their votes as a group. Now, while there's a whole lot of rules on how the caucuses work and certain thresholds a candidate must meet in order to be awarded delegates, the main thing I want you to recognize is that caucus systems are extremely more costly in terms of voting than a primary election. And if you live in a state that holds a primary, you can go to your polling precinct at any time of the day and cast your ballot. Caucuses, on the other hand, require all voters to attend the polling precinct at the same time and cast their votes together, in groups. In some states, the caucus convention occurs on a weeknight, and voters have to wait until midnight or even later for their votes to be counted and processed. And in other states, caucuses take place in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday. It really all just depends. And as you can imagine, voters who hold multiple jobs or can't afford to find adequate childcare face the largest obstacles to voting in caucuses because there's such a large time commitment. In other words, it's extremely more costly. Moreover, the results of the Iowa caucus often set the tone for the entirety of the primary election, considering that it is the first caucus of the primary season. Thus, whoever wins the Iowa primary often receives a big advantage in subsequent elections because voters will perceive that candidate as having more momentum than other candidates. So this is referred to as the bandwagon effect, where we see that one candidate might be winning a lot of the early races. We really want our votes to matter. So we might jump on the bandwagon of that more successful candidate who has more momentum, so our vote counts. And keep in mind, only about 170,000 Iowans voted in the 2020 Iowa caucus. So you have a very small percentage of Americans who are mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly over the age of 45, who really set the tone of the primaries. Primary elections come with their own faults as well. There are 3 types of primaries that dictate who can and cannot participate in the primary election. A closed primary means that voters can only vote on the ballot of the party with which they are registered to vote. For instance, a registered Democrat can only vote on the Democrat Party's nominees. Independents cannot participate at all. An open primary is one in which voters registered with a political party may choose the ballot of either party. In this system, a registered Republican may vote in the Democratic primary, and a registered Democrat may vote in the Republican primary. A semi-closed primary is just like a closed primary, meaning that if you're registered Republican, you must vote in the Republican primary, but independents may choose which primary they'd like to participate in. Lastly, runoff elections are extremely common in the American South, and they were originally created as a way to safeguard the political establishment at the time. If a candidate is unable to secure at least 50% plus one of the vote in a primary, then the two candidates with the highest vote totals must face off against each other in a special runoff election. So this is especially problematic when you've got a really crowded primary, meaning 4, 5, or more candidates are running together in the primary. It's almost mathematically impossible for one of those candidates to secure more than 50% of the vote. Runoff elections also have significant implications for Democratic candidates, since we know that Republicans are significantly more likely to turn out in special runoff elections, making it much more difficult for Democratic candidates to win these runoff elections. Another critical component of the primary season is each state's timing of their election. Primary elections and caucuses are held over a 5-month period beginning in February. As we discussed earlier, because the primaries and caucuses held early in the season can have a significant impact on a presidential candidate's success, states often compete over scheduling of their elections. The trend of states moving their primaries and caucuses earlier and earlier in the primary season in order to have more influence over the outcome of the nomination process is referred to as front-loading. Running a campaign is an expensive and time-consuming affair, so presidential candidates tend to put a lot of their resources into the early primaries to establish themselves as viable and to create momentum for their campaigns. Candidates who do not perform well in the early primaries tend to drop out of the race when it becomes clear that they have little chance of winning their party's nomination. Consequently, the timing of state primaries has real repercussions for the nomination process. Now, before the primaries begin, the DNC and the RNC decide when each state will hold its primary. But some states will choose to bump up their election date to try to exert more influence over the election. In 2008, Michigan and Florida did just this thing, and the national committees responded by refusing to seat the state delegates at the national convention. Though once John McCain and Barack Obama secured the number of delegates needed to win their respective nominations, both parties ultimately decided to seat those states at the nominating convention. So we've talked a lot about this nominating convention and delegates, and I just want to clarify what exactly we're talking about here when it comes to whose vote really matters in these presidential primaries. So when you cast your primary election ballot, you're technically not voting for the candidate, but instead you're voting for delegates to represent that candidate at the national nominating convention. And you guessed it, each state has different rules for how to count primary election ballots. Let's take the Democratic primary, for example. Now, based on a bunch of arbitrary calculations and thresholds, the Democratic presidential candidate needs to secure at least 1,991 delegates to receive the party nomination. And here's how many delegates each state is awarded in the Democratic primary. And as a candidate, you need to win at least 15% of the state's total vote in order to be awarded any delegates at all. And let's be clear, the Republican Party uses the same arbitrary logic requiring their nominee to receive at least 1,237 delegates. And just to add one more layer of complication, the Republican primary rules vary a lot at the state level. For instance, the RNC awards California 172 delegates in total for the Republican primary. And based upon the state's rules, whoever wins the most votes wins all of the state's delegates. So you could win with 30% of the vote or with 75% of the vote. As long as you have more than your competitors, i.e. first past the post, you get all 172 delegates for the nominating convention. versus Massachusetts, for example, which awards delegates on a proportional basis, such that Trump won 50% of the primary vote in Massachusetts, so he was awarded 22 out of 42, or half, of Massachusetts delegates. So it's pretty much a huge, jumbled, confusing mess all the way around. So as a quick recap, after the people have cast their vote during the primaries across all of the states, nominees are selected at their respective party conventions by state delegates. This occurs via the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, held this summer preceding the November election. And you may recall the historic virtual nominating conventions that were held earlier this year during the pandemic. Oh, and one last thing, if you're not thoroughly confused by this point, there's one last thing called superdelegates, which is unique to the Democratic National Convention. And superdelegates are allowed to cast their votes at the nominating convention for basically any candidate they prefer, regardless of how the rest of the country voted. And the one thing I really want you to keep in mind here is that the reason that all of these rules are so complicated and so confusing and so counterintuitive is really just so those who are in power can maintain their power. And I know that may sound pessimistic, but our democracy, since its inception, has been fascinated with the idea of limiting the power of the people. And as we've discussed throughout this class, it has taken hundreds of years just to allow every single American adult the right to vote. It wasn't even until 1912, with the passage of the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution, that the people were allowed to vote for their United States senators. Before that, the state legislatures made that decision. And even today, through the institution of primary elections just 50 years ago was a step in the right direction, there are still massive problems with the fairness of these elections. And at the end of the day, it's still a handful of elites that ultimately choose who the party nominees will be, and not the voters. And we haven't even got to the Electoral College yet, which is just another political elite barrier that muffles the true will and voice of the American people. So, like I say throughout this class, it's just critical to be informed on how our government actually functions, because it's constantly changing and evolving, sometimes becoming more fair and open, and sometimes becoming more closed and restrictive. So it's my hope that this class helps you recognize areas that our government can improve upon, and that you use that information to help inform your opinions and attitudes about American government. Finally, after the long primary season, it's on to the general election. So the nominee from each party who won the primary election will face one another at the general election. This is when the Democrat faces the Republican, and based upon the political climate, 1, 2, 3, or 4 third-party candidates will also face off in the general election. In the United States, elections are based on a first-past-the-post or plurality election rule, meaning whoever gets more votes than their opponent is declared the winner, of the popular vote at least. Lastly, the Electoral College casts its vote, usually based upon the popular vote for president, but not always. And the Electoral College consists of 538 votes. Now, we get that number because it's based on the representation in Congress. 100 senators, 438 members of the House of Representatives. Keep in mind that the additional 3 come from Washington, D.C. Otherwise, we have 435 members in the United States House of Representatives. And candidates need 50% plus 1 of the Electoral College, or 270 electoral votes, to win the presidency. Now, I can't even see you guys right now, but I can just feel you rolling your eyes at this because, of course, it is extremely complicated. And some may even argue unnecessarily complicated. So I know we've covered a lot. These election rules are, extremely complicated. So I just want to show a really quick video that breaks down how the Electoral College works in about 5 minutes, I think. So let's watch that video real quick, and then we'll return to the lecture.
Election day, when Americans everywhere cast their ballot for the next president of the United States. Except, not really. Americans don't directly vote for president. So what's happening on election day then? It's a bit complicated because of something called the Electoral College. To keep things simple for now, think of the Electoral College as the collection of 538 votes that determine who the President of the United States will be. Why 538? Because that's the number of senators, 100, plus the number of representatives, 438 in Congress. Why are there 438 representatives in Congress? Stop asking so many questions right now, we're trying to keep this simple. These 538 votes in the Electoral College aren't given to the citizens directly, but are instead divided among the states. So how does the Electoral College give out the votes? Each state, no matter how populous or not, gets 3 votes to start. The remaining votes are given out roughly in proportion to the population of the states. The more people the state has, the more votes it gets. Here's a map of the United States showing the voting power each state has by making one hexagon equal to one Electoral College vote for president. Because Electoral College votes mostly, though not completely, scale with population, it's also a map of where people live with a bonus given to the smaller states to make them a bit bigger than they would otherwise be. In early November, when citizens go to the polls, they aren't voting for president directly, but they're really telling their state how they want it to use its electoral votes. 48 of the 50 states give all their Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins a majority in their state. Take Florida, for example, which has 29 Electoral College votes. If a candidate wins a majority, no matter how small that majority, he gets all the votes. So the path to the White House is clear. Win enough majorities in enough states to get more than half of the Electoral College votes, and you get to sit at the big desk. That wasn't so complicated, you say? Well, there were a few details left out. The Electoral College loves states, but what about the 11 million Americans who don't live in a state? What happens to their vote, and where are these people hiding? There are about 600,000 in the District of Columbia, an area set aside specifically not to be a state so that the capital of the country would be free of local politics. For most of the United States history, people living in the district didn't get to vote for president. Then, in 1964, the Constitution was amended to give D.C. the same number of votes as the least populous state, Wyoming. So the Electoral College likes D.C., but you know who it doesn't like? The territories. The often forgotten Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Northern Mariana Islands get no votes from the Electoral College because they aren't states and they don't have a special constitutional amendment to recognize them. Which is a bit odd considering they're part of the United States and everyone who lives there is a citizen, so for most practical purposes they're just like D.C., and 4.4 million people live in the territories. That might not sound like a lot, but it's more than the populations of Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Delaware combined. But still, no votes from the Electoral College do they get. The whole situation with territories is extra strange when you consider the final group of Americans who don't live in the states, the 6.3 million Americans who live abroad. If you're a United States citizen who moves to a foreign country, you can usually send a postal vote to the last state that you resided in. But if you move within the United States to one of its territories, you lose your right to vote for president as long as you live there, making these the only spots on the whole earth where Americans are not allowed to vote for president. Actually, they're the only spots in the whole universe because American astronauts are allowed to vote from space. The last bit of Electoral College complication is the weirdest and has to do with the votes themselves. The state of Florida and all the others don't really give votes to a candidate. That's just a simplified way to think about it, because the reality of the situation is odd. What citizens are voting for on election day is a group of electors appointed by the political parties who choose the president on the citizens' behalf. The number of votes that a state gets from the Electoral College is actually the number of electors the state is allowed to send to a collegiate meeting to vote on who the president will be. What makes it odd is that while these electors promise they will vote for president as their state citizens want them to, they aren't required to do so. Electors are free to vote the way they want. While this has never swung an election, 87 times in the past electors have voted against the wishes of the very people who elected them. Why set up this crazy system where a small group of people essentially unknown to the general public are the ones who really decide on the president? Because in the 1700s, when the Electoral College was designed, the quickest way to send a piece of information was to write it down on a piece of paper, hand it to a guy on a horse, wish him "Godspeed, good sir," and hope he didn't get killed by Indians or die of dysentery along the way. Because information moved so slowly, and because the young country was so big, the idea was to send all the electors to Washington where they could have the most up-to-date information to make decisions for the people back home who wouldn't know the latest news. Though now, when we carry information on beams of light in fiber optic cables rather than on the backs of herd animals, this particular aspect of the Electoral College might seem a little out of date. Nonetheless, while most people think that the election for president takes place in early November, it doesn't. That's the election that determines who the electors will be. The 538 electors who are chosen then meet in early December, and they cast the real votes that determine who is the next president of the United States.
Okay, so I think that video points out a few interesting things and kind of clarifies several misconceptions that people often have about the Electoral College. And let's kind of talk about the 2016 election briefly, because I think some people are under the impression that, these historic Electoral College upsets, such in the case as Clinton v. Trump or Gore v. Bush was the fact that these candidates won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. I think some people are sometimes under the misconception that that is because members of the Electoral College switched their vote, meaning that majority of people in their state voted for one candidate, but the members of the Electoral College intentionally switched their vote for another candidate. And that's not the case, at least in the Trump-Clinton election, nor the Gore-Bush election. And as you can see here, Donald Trump won far more states than Hillary Clinton did. And you've probably heard the statistic, Hillary Clinton won 2.8 million more votes than Donald Trump, but she still lost the Electoral College. And when we just look at this map, it's very clear, right? I mean, there's California, there's Nevada, there's Washington, New York. I mean, those were the major states that she won. But all of these Electoral College votes, right, nestled throughout the center of the United States, brought Trump well over the 270 margin needed to win the Electoral College. And this is really just a function, as the video points out, of really old kind of justifications for having that type of system in the first place. And what we end up with is a electoral design that significantly overrepresents rural America. If we look at this graph here, or figure or chart, whatever it is, some social scientists estimate by 2050 that 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. So those areas with the most attractive metropolitan areas, those areas with the biggest job growth, that's where 70% of Americans are estimated to live by 2050. So metropolitan areas will be represented by 30 senators, while rural areas will be represented with 70 senators. And that has a significant impact on this outdated Electoral College system. And so we can even look at the projections for 2020 and see that, yes, California, Washington, New York, these continue to be major sources of votes for Democratic candidates. But basically everything else in the center of the map is up for grabs. We're also in a fascinating political era where Texas and Georgia are now considered swing states, which, I mean, these states haven't voted blue in decades. So just a lot of things to think about in terms of the pros and cons of the Electoral College, and whether the Electoral College does in fact overrepresent rural America or not, and things to consider there. So overall, the Electoral College does preserve the principle of federalism. It allows a division of labor for conducting elections at the state level, and to some extent it does equalize power among small states. Cons, on the other hand, turnout matters less, considering that each state has a solid number of delegates to award at the end of the day. Candidates can win the popular vote, but they can lose the electoral vote, and candidates spend more time in battleground states than in the rest of the country. I mean, I'm recording this lecture on Halloween right now, and where are the candidates? They're alternating between Florida and Pennsylvania. So we end up with candidates spending all of their time and campaign resources to voters that represent a fraction of the United States population. So it certainly creates some disparities there. Okay, and it seems that my neighbors have decided to light fireworks in the middle of my lecture, and I guess that's what I get for recording on a Saturday, so you will just have to bear with me for the rest of this lecture. Okay, so the overview. So we've discussed the differences between the primary and the general election, types of primaries and caucuses. We've discussed the delegates and the nominating convention, gone over some of the basics of the general election, and talked about the Electoral College. So these are all a lot of questions that you will see on the next exam. All right, now the last thing that I want to talk about in the campaigns and elections chapter, we have to talk about campaigns. So I want to talk briefly about just a few types of notable campaign strategies, give you a very brief history of campaign finance reform in the United States, and then I think we will kind of wrap it up on that note. So let's go ahead and get started. You're getting 2 for 1 lecture today. Okay, so political campaigns adopt strategies and employ tactics depending on a number of factors related to the stage of the election cycle, the level of office being sought, the characteristics of the state or district, and the degree of competition for the seat. And finally, financial resources play a major role in this calculus as well. A campaign strategy is the overall approach used to convince citizens to vote for the candidate, while campaign tactics are the specific procedures used to execute the strategy. So there's 3 basic strategies of campaigns that I would like you to know. One is the party-centered strategy, in which a candidate relies on the party's platform and record, as well as the organization's resources to appeal to voters' partisan identification. A second basic strategy is an issue-oriented strategy, which is directed at a group of Americans with strong preferences towards policy on specific issues. And a final strategy is the candidate-oriented strategy. And a candidate using this strategy organizes the campaign efforts around his or her personal characteristics, such as experience, leadership, integrity, or values. Throughout a campaign cycle, a candidate may rely on all 3 of these strategies. For instance, a party-oriented strategy would be less useful during the nomination process since the candidate is competing with other members of his or her party for the party's nomination. A party-centered strategy appears to be most useful when voters have less political knowledge and are more likely to rely on party identification as a shortcut for making a voting decision. This strategy, therefore, may be more useful during the general election when voter turnout is generally high and includes voters with low levels of political knowledge. Issue-oriented strategies are more common during the primaries, since candidates of the same party are trying to distinguish themselves from the party competition. Issue-oriented strategies are also very common in highly competitive elections where candidates have to go beyond simple party allegiance and convince voters why they deserve to be elected. Now, watch campaign advertising closely for an example of this. Candidates in highly competitive races spend a lot of money on advertising to outline their policy agenda to try to persuade voters. Elections that are uncompetitive, or when one candidate is clearly projected to win, will often run these feel-good advertisements with little substantive content that simply try to remind candidates that they're on the ballot and that they should vote for them. Finally, candidate-oriented ads have typically been reserved for candidates with little name recognition, but they have become increasingly popular over the last few years, especially with the development of social media. These type of campaign strategies tend to emphasize the candidate's character and their values and convince you that they're an average American, just like us. The beer test is a really good example. When candidates visit the local pub on the campaign trail and they have a beer with the blue-collar folk. It's this bizarre pattern candidates use to prove that they're relatable, and you see it in every single election. It always cracks me up. So next election, just keep your eye out for the beer test. It's hilarious. During the last Democratic presidential primary, Elizabeth Warren faced huge criticism for doing this. She tried to improvise on the beer strategy, and she filmed herself talking about politics while drinking a beer in her kitchen on Instagram Live. And a lot of people complained about this, that it made it look like she was pandering to voters, and then other people got really upset because she's a female candidate, and it's like, what, she can't have a beer? That's so misogynistic. And the internet just went crazy, as they do, over everything. I argue what about politics doesn't involve pandering, but I guess that's just my perspective. At any rate, that's the price of running for office. Everything you do, every little thing that you do, is up for criticism. So in order to employ the tactics necessary to execute a chosen campaign strategy, candidates must rely heavily on one resource in particular. Can you guess what it is? It's money. In fact, many political analysts refer to the early stages of the primary as the green primary. Don't have enough money to keep your campaign afloat before the Iowa caucus? You may as well kiss your candidacy goodbye. Candidates with well-stocked war chests are able to use their resources to pursue a variety of tactics, including advertising, traveling to make public appearances and meet constituents, and accommodating the press. Through advertising, candidates increase their name recognition, they communicate their personal characteristics and issue positions, and portray opponents in a negative light through negative advertising. Many campaigns are staffed by paid consultants and advisors who are responsible for seeking campaign supporters and donors, tracking public opinion, spreading the word about the candidates through direct mailing and media advertisements, and coordinating public appearances. Candidates often make public appearances because they garner media coverage, which serves as a free source of advertising. And as former House Speaker Tip O'Neill once observed, I love this quote, "There are 4 parts to any campaign: the candidate, the issues of the candidate, the campaign organization, and the money to run the campaign with. Without money, you can forget about the other 3. So candidates spend a considerable amount of time fundraising in order to build up their campaign war chests, but they must do so within the parameters of the federal and state laws regulating campaign finance. Which brings us to the delightful topic of campaign finance reform, or lack thereof. Campaign finance reform is a major subject of debate when it comes to both presidential and congressional elections. In large part, this is due to dramatic increases in spending over the last 25 years. Candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives need a sizable war chest to win a seat representing a congressional district, and candidates for the Senate need an even larger one to win a seat representing an entire state. In 2018, successful candidates in House races spent over $2 million on average, while successful candidates in the Senate spent almost $16 million. Still, these numbers pale in comparison to what it costs to win the White House. During the 2016 presidential election, the 2 major party nominees, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, spent over $2 billion combined. But wait, there's more. For the 2020 presidential election, which spending is still not over yet, more than $14 billion has already been spent. $14 billion. So just take a moment to think about all of the other things that money could go to instead of funding political campaigns. Okay, so let's go over a brief history of campaign finance reform, and we're going to talk a little bit about Citizens United, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and kind of break down everything in the realm of campaign finance in this lecture. So in the aftermath of Nixon's Watergate scandal, which grossly misused campaign donations, Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act Amendments of 1974. So in this act, people could donate unlimited money to parties, but were limited in the amount of money they could contribute directly to a candidate. Note, this is referred to as hard money. However, parties were still able to funnel money directly to candidates, which is known as soft money. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, or BCRA, marks the most recent piece of major legislation geared toward limiting spending by candidates and advocacy groups to influence elections. Introduced by Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Russell Feingold in 2002, the act faced considerable opposition from lawmakers, interest groups, and citizens who saw it as a violation of the First Amendment right to free speech. The BCRA essentially replaced legislation from 1971 that limited the amount that individuals, organizations, and political action committees, or PACs, more on this next week, could donate to election campaigns. The original law, FECA, which we just talked about on the previous slide, distinguished between hard money for candidates and soft money for campaigns. It targeted hard money by limiting individual contributions to $1,000 and PAC contributions to $5,000, but it placed no restriction on soft money contributions. So, not surprisingly, this figure illustrates the amount of soft money raised by both national parties before the BCRA went into effect and the massive impact the ban had on soft money in the 2004 election cycle. Despite the elimination of soft money contributions, however, the new regulations do not appear to have had a negative impact on either party's ability to raise funds. According to the Federal Election Commission, 2004 constituted a record year for both parties in terms of campaign finance. Democratic receipts for the 2004 presidential election cycle were over 89% higher than those collected during the 2000 presidential election cycle. Similarly, Republican receipts for 2004 were 46% higher than they were in 2000. Then, in 2008 is where the rules of campaign finance began to truly come off the rails. The BCRA also included provisions regulating electioneering communications, which are defined by the FEC as those communications that refer to a federal candidate in the days leading up to an election. The BCRA aimed at limiting issue advocacy ads sponsored by groups like 527 organizations unaffiliated with a particular candidate, again more on this next week, from flooding media markets within 30 days of a primary election or 60 days of a general election. It further prohibited corporations from using Treasury funds to sponsor these types of communications. So in 2008, a conservative political organization called Citizens United attempted to broadcast a lengthy political advertisement critical of Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, called Hillary the Movie. A documentary funded through corporate and individual donations was set to air during the primary phase of the presidential election, but was blocked by the FEC. However, in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission 2010, the Supreme Court struck down sections of the BCRA that banned political advertising by corporations, citing First Amendment protections. This controversial decision was alternatively hailed by supporters as a victory for free speech rights and condemned by critics as a corruption of the democratic process. Its full implications for the role of money in electoral politics still remain to be seen, but perhaps the most damaging impact has been the legal precedent set that corporations were essentially granted personhood, given the right to free speech, and that spending money is a form of speech. So overall, elections are central to our democratic political system, and their structure reflects the variety of federal regulations, state laws, party rules, and local political cultures in place across America. Some states use primaries to nominate party candidates for office, while others use caucuses. Some states get priority scheduling for their primary and caucus events, such as New Hampshire and Iowa, while others face party sanctions for moving their elections. Voter registration laws and local political climates can affect turnout, leading some races to be decided by a fraction of the population and others to break records for political participation. Finally, campaigns can have a real impact on American politics, which originates with candidate efforts to get on the ballot, mobilize voters, raise campaign funds, focus the debate, set the political agenda, and ultimately win control over our government. Elections are exciting to watch because they bring together the candidates, the voters, the political process, and the high stakes involved in a heated race to the finish line. It's important to remember that the Constitution didn't originally call for direct elections of national office holders, with the exception of the House of Representatives. The founders premised our political structure on a system of indirect election. The people would choose the representative to select leaders on their behalf. And before the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, state legislatures selected U.S. senators. Even today, voters in their respective states appoint electors who participate in choosing each president through the institution of the Electoral College. These processes are important because elections serve to bring about change, legitimize our government, and provide accountability. And without elections, we would have no influence on the composition of our government and no way of shaping its policies and activities. We may sometimes be frustrated with an indirect nature of our system and the impact that it has on elections, but this does not mean that voting is futile. And as Al Gore stated in 2008, take it from me, elections matter. So I hope you enjoyed this week's lecture. And don't forget to go out and vote before Tuesday if you have not done so already. This is a really unique election year, and I'm sure we will have a lot to talk about after the election results come in. So I'll try to break that down at the beginning of next week's lecture, depending on how well the states are able to count all of the record number mail-in ballots this election. But overall, that's it for this week's lecture. I know we covered a lot of material, and some of it is pretty complicated, so please feel free to use the discussion board this week if you have any questions from this week's material. I am certain you will not be the only one to have those questions, and I'll be happy to answer those for you guys on the discussion board. So until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.